Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something, use every single day probably, but probably never really stop to think about deeply, causation.
Hmm.
But specifically, the metaphysics of causation, which is kind of just a fancy way of saying, going beyond just the surface level,
Yeah.
kind of trying to understand what it really means for one thing to cause another.
Yeah, it's like looking under the hood of reality in a way, like
Yeah,
trying to figure out the fundamental machinery that makes everything tick.
exactly. Yeah. And to guide us through this journey, we have a pretty dense, I'll be honest, article from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
But don't worry, we'll distill all the most interesting parts, I
Yeah,
promise.
we'll pull
And
out the juicy bits and leave the rest.
exactly. And I'm really excited to tackle this topic, especially with you, because
Yep.
I know you have a real knack for explaining even the most kind of head-scratching concepts.
Well, I appreciate that. I do find this stuff fascinating. So hopefully I can make it clear for everyone listening.
Yeah, I think so. So the article, really starts by just highlighting how absolutely central causation
Mm-hmm.
is to the way that we understand the world. Like we
Right.
use it to explain everything from why the toast burned this morning to, like how galaxies form.
It's true, yeah. I mean, it, it's kind of the glue that holds our understanding of everything together, really.
Yeah.
The past, the future, even how we make choices in the present.
Yeah.
It's all about cause and effect.
It really is
Wow.
like a hidden framework almost.
Yeah.
But the article doesn't just, kind of take causation for granted.
Right.
It really digs into like, well, what does this concept actually mean?
Right.
And how can we even be sure that it exists at all?
Yeah. Yeah. It gets into the nitty-gritty of how we define causation
Yeah.
and explores different philosophical viewpoints on it, which, they all have their kind of strengths and weaknesses.
Right. Okay. So let's get into some of those viewpoints.
Yeah, let's do it.
So one of the article starts off with is this idea of regularity in causation, like basically saying, if A happens, does B always follow?
Right, right. And that comes from the observation that a lot of times when we see causal relationships, there are these kind of predictable patterns, right? If you strike a match, it'll light.
Right. Right.
But the question is that regularity enough to really define what causation is?
Right. What about those cases where the light switch doesn't work,
Mm.
or the match is damp and
Yeah.
it doesn't light?
Exactly. Yeah.
Does that mean there's no causal relationship there?
Well, that's one of the things that the article kind of brings up is like, these regularity theories, they have to account for those exceptions. And how do we distinguish between, regularities that are causal and ones that are just, coincidences?
Okay, so maybe constant regularity isn't the key then. What about a different approach? Like those Back to the Future scenarios where you go back in time and change something.
Ah, time travel. Always a fun thought experiment.
Right. So the article talks about something called counterfactual theories.
Right. And these theories, they basically ask, like, well, what would have happened if the cause hadn't happened?
Okay.
So they're really focused on this idea that a cause makes a difference, right? That if the cause hadn't occurred, things would have unfolded differently.
It makes you wonder, like, if you could really mess things up with time travel,
Yeah, there's a whole can of worms there.
for sure. But seriously, it is kind of mind-bending, that idea that, causation is about what didn't happen.
Yeah, it really is. And it gets into some tricky areas too, because how do we really know what would have happened if things had been different?
Right, right. It's all hypothetical. Okay, so if regularity isn't perfect and time travel's a bit tricky, maybe we need a more nuanced approach. So the article also mentions these probabilistic theories.
Right. And these focus on the idea that causes, they don't necessarily guarantee their effects.
Okay.
They just make them more likely.
Okay.
So, think about smoking and lung cancer.
Right.
Smoking doesn't automatically cause cancer, but it makes it way more likely.
So it's like a game of chance where the cause is kind of loading the dice a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Right.
Like it's making a particular outcome more likely, but it's not a sure thing.
Right. Right.
And these probabilistic theories, they've actually become, pretty popular, especially in fields like medicine and social science, where you're often dealing with statistical relationships rather than these kind of like absolute certainties.
Okay, so we've got these three main contenders, right?
Yeah.
Regularity, counterfactuals, and probabilities.
That's right.
And it seems like each one has something to offer, but also some limitations.
Yeah, and that's what makes this, so interesting, because it's not about finding like the one perfect theory that explains every single instance of causation.
Right.
It's more about understanding like the pros and cons of each approach and how they might apply differently in different contexts.
Right. Before we get into the context, what about some of those other challenges to understanding causation that the article mentions? Like those real head scratchers, like mental causation and causal overdetermination.
Oh, yeah. Those are some of the really fun ones.
Right.
So mental causation, for example, it asks, like, how can our thoughts and desires, which seem to be, non-physical things,
Right.
how can they actually cause things to happen in the physical world?
Yeah. Like, how does my decision to, reach for that cup of coffee actually result in my arm moving and my hand wrapping around it?
Right. Yeah.
It seems so simple. But then when you really think about that connection between the mental and the physical, it's kind of bizarre.
It really is. Yeah. And then you've got causal overdetermination,
Yeah.
which that explores scenarios where you could have multiple different causes that could all lead to the same effect.
Okay.
So imagine like a Rube Goldberg machine where, you've got a ball rolling down a ramp and it could be triggered by either, a lever flipping or a domino falling.
Right.
So which one is the real cause if both of them could have done the job?
Right. Like, it's like trying to untangle a web where, like, every thread is connected to, like, 5 other threads.
Yeah.
Where do you even start?
Exactly. Yeah. It makes you wonder, like, what does it even mean to talk about the cause in those kinds of situations? So far we've been talking about, all this like theoretical framework of causation, all these different ways philosophers are trying to define it and stuff. But I think it's important to kind of connect this back to you, the listener. Like, why should you care about these kind of abstract philosophical debates,
Yeah, that's a great point. It's easy to get lost in the theory, but I'm curious, like, how does this stuff actually play out in the real world?
Well, for one thing, understanding causation is like super important for science.
Okay.
Like, how do we design experiments? How do we draw conclusions
Right.
if we don't have a solid grasp of cause and effect?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Scientists are always trying to figure out what causes what, but, like, what about for the rest of us who aren't, running experiments in a lab?
Well, think about the legal system, for example.
Okay.
Causation is at the heart of so many legal cases, like
Right.
figuring out who is responsible for an accident often hinges on establishing a clear causal chain of events.
Right, like if someone runs a red light and causes a car crash, it's pretty obvious who's at fault.
Right, exactly.
But what about those cases where it's not so clear-cut?
Yeah, exactly. Think about like a product liability case.
Okay.
Like if someone gets sick after using a certain product, lawyers have to prove that the product actually caused the illness. And that can be really tricky.
Right.
Was it the product itself? Was it something else entirely? Was the product used correctly? All these questions kind of come up.
Right, so it's more than just an intellectual exercise. It has, like, real-world implications,
Yeah, for sure.
What about on a more personal level, though? Does it affect how we see ourselves?
Yeah.
Our choices?
Absolutely. Causation is like deeply intertwined with our ideas about, free will and responsibility.
Right.
Like, if our actions are just the result of this long chain of causes and effects, does that mean we're not really in control?
That's a pretty huge question.
Yes. Yeah.
If everything is predetermined, like, what does that say about our ability to make choices and be held accountable for them?
Right. And it's a debate that's been going on for like centuries. And there's no easy answer, but thinking about causation can kind of help us at least wrestle with these really fundamental questions about, human agency and the nature of free will.
Okay, so we've established that causation is important for science, for law, even for our, like, personal beliefs.
Yeah.
But let's go back to those tricky challenges that we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
The ones that the article mentioned.
Yeah.
Like, how do philosophers actually try to deal with those head scratchers, like mental causation, for example?
Well, mental causation, it's a tough one because you have to kind of bridge the gap between the mental and the physical world, right? Like, how can a thought, which doesn't seem to be made of matter,
Right.
how can it actually cause a physical action?
Yeah, like, it's almost like there's this invisible string connecting our minds to our bodies.
Exactly. Yeah. So some philosophers try to solve this by arguing that mental states are are actually reducible to physical states.
Yep.
So your thought about grabbing that coffee is really just like a complex pattern of neurons firing in your brain.
Okay.
And that physical activity is what ultimately leads to the physical action.
So it's like our thoughts are just a kind of physical process in a way.
That's one way to look at it, but others argue that that kind of reductionist view kind of misses something crucial about the subjective experience of having a thought or a feeling,
Right.
you know? So they say that mental states have this unique kind of causal power that can't be like fully explained by physical processes alone.
So it's kind of still a mystery then?
In a lot of ways, yeah. The
Okay.
relationship between the mental and the physical is like one of the most enduring puzzles in philosophy.
Okay. What about causal overdetermination? Like
Yeah.
how do philosophers try to grapple with those cases where you could have like multiple different causes that could all lead to the same effect?
Well, one way is to just kind of accept that there are multiple causes, and that's okay. You know, it doesn't mean that causation is meaningless. It just means that, you know, the causal picture can be more complex than we might initially think.
So instead of looking for like the cause, we might need to think in terms of like a whole web of contributing factors.
Exactly, yeah. And in some cases, we might be able to identify like a primary cause or a proximate cause, even if there are other things that contributed.
Okay, so it's not always about like finding the smoking gun. It's about understanding how all these different causes kind of play together.
Right, exactly. And the article also talks about how different causal theories kind of handle these tricky scenarios.
Okay.
Like regularity theories might struggle with overdetermination because it breaks that one-to-one mapping of cause and effect.
Right. So if multiple things could have caused the same outcome, how can we say that any one of them was like the regular cause?
Precisely, yeah. Counterfactual theories, on the other hand, they might offer a different perspective because they could argue that if any one of those potential causes had been absent, the effect wouldn't have occurred.
Okay.
So each one could be considered a cause in its own right.
So each potential cause is kind of essential in its own way.
Yeah.
It's like saying if you take away any one ingredient from a recipe, the final dish isn't going to be the same, you know?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And
Okay.
then probabilistic theories might take a more nuanced approach by looking at how each potential cause contributes to the overall probability of the effect.
So it's like each one is adding another like weight to the dice, making that outcome more and more likely.
Exactly, yeah. So you can see how each theory kind of offers a slightly different lens for looking at these complex scenarios.
Man, this is making my brain hurt in a good way.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me how something that we take for granted every single day can be so philosophically like rich and complex.
It is, yeah. That's the beauty of philosophy, right? It takes these seemingly simple concepts and forces us to look at them in new and kind of unexpected ways.
For sure. Before we get too philosophical though, I'm curious how does the article connect all of this back to, you know, our understanding of the universe as a whole?
Oh, that's a great question. And the article actually ends by discussing the implications of causation for our understanding of the laws of nature and the nature of time itself.
Okay, so we're getting really big picture now.
Yeah, we're going big.
Right.
And one of the key questions here is whether the laws of nature are fundamentally causal.
Okay.
So do the laws of physics, for example, describe causal relationships, or are they just descriptions of regularities?
So it's like, are they telling us why things happen or just how they happen?
Exactly. Yeah. And this ties into our understanding of time as well. You know, does time flow in one direction because of the causal structure of the universe?
Yeah. Whoa. So like the arrow of time might actually be driven by cause and effect.
That's one idea. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's something that physicists and philosophers are still kind of debating.
Okay. So we've gone from like everyday examples all the way to the laws of physics. It seems like causation is like woven into the very fabric of reality, you know. But after all this discussion, like, do we actually have any definitive answers about what causation is?
Well, that's the big question, right? And like a lot of philosophical questions, the answer is maybe less about finding a single right answer and more about like deepening our understanding,
Yep.
you know? And the Stanford Encyclopedia article, it doesn't really say like this is the right theory of causation, you know.
Right.
It more encourages us to think about how these different theories might be like useful or limited depending on what we're trying to explain.
So it's less about finding like the ultimate truth of causation and more about like having different tools for different situations, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Like, for example, regularity theories, they might be totally fine for explaining simple causal relationships, like, flipping a light switch.
Right.
But when you get into more complex things like human behavior or social dynamics, then maybe probabilistic theories give you a better picture.
It's like having a toolbox with different wrenches for different size nuts and bolts.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
wouldn't use a sledgehammer to try and tighten a tiny screw.
Right, exactly. And counterfactual theories, they might be most helpful when we're trying to like isolate specific causes in really complicated situations like in a legal case where you're trying to figure out like who's responsible for something.
Right. So it's not about like one right theory to rule them all. It's about picking the best tool for the job.
Yeah, exactly. And this kind of brings us back to why understanding causation even matters. Like even if we don't have all the answers, just wrestling with these philosophical questions, it can help us understand ourselves better, the world around us and even like the nature of reality itself.
Yeah, I got to admit, I've never really thought about causation this deeply before.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing how something so fundamental to our experience can be so philosophically like rich.
It really is. And the article does a really good job of bringing that out, I think.
Mhm.
It doesn't shy away from how complex and challenging this stuff can be, but it also presents it in a way that I think is really engaging and easy to grasp, even if you're not like a professional philosopher.
I mean, it's definitely made me think about the world in a new way.
Yeah.
I don't think I can look at like a simple cause and effect relationship the same way again.
That's the power of philosophy, right?
Yeah.
It helps us see the familiar with fresh eyes and appreciate just how much depth there is to even the simplest ideas.
So what would you say is like the one thing you hope listeners take away from this deep dive into causation?
I think the biggest takeaway is that causation, as simple as it might seem on the surface, it's actually a really tricky concept, and there are all these different layers of meaning and interpretation.
Right.
And just being aware of that, being aware that there are all these different ways of thinking about causation, it can help us, navigate the world more thoughtfully, make better decisions.
It's like a reminder that even the most basic ideas are worth taking a second look at.
Exactly. It's through questioning and exploring and really engaging with these fundamental ideas that we can really expand our understanding of ourselves and the universe.
Well said. This has been a really incredible deep dive into the world of causation. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise and your insights.
Oh, my pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this little intellectual adventure. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a new and fascinating topic.